There is an architecture to a life well lived, or so the magazines and curated social media feeds would have you believe. It is a structure of clean lines and intentional spaces, built from the sturdy materials of ambition and achievement. Its foundation is a prestigious degree, its framework a soaring career trajectory. The windows are wide and clear, offering panoramic views of success, and the interior is furnished with the tangible evidence of good taste and a healthy income. By all these metrics, Ilara Vance resided in a masterpiece of modern design. She had followed the blueprint with meticulous, unwavering precision. She had built the perfect life. The only problem was, she couldn't bear to live inside it. The illusion was most fragile in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city's relentless hum subsided to a low, distant whisper. In these moments, the silence of her apartment on the 27th floor was not a sanctuary but an accuser. It was a vast, echoing chamber that amplified the profound emptiness at her core. The space itself, which had cost a small fortune and won a feature in a design blog, felt like a meticulously crafted tune for a woman who was still breathing. The cool, polished concrete floors offered no comfort, the designer's sofa no solace. The art on the walls, abstract canvases of muted tones that were meant to be sophisticated and calming, felt like visual representations of her own muted soul. They were beautiful, expensive, and had absolutely nothing to say. Her life had become a series of exquisite surfaces reflecting nothing of substance. Take, for example, her job. As the creative director at Axiom, one of the city's most sought-after branding agencies, she was a veritable high priestess of surface and suggestion. She could take a mundane product, a bottle of water, a bar of soap, a subscription service for artisanal dog biscuits, and wrap it in a narrative so compelling, so aspirational, that people would line up to pay a premium for the privilege of buying into the story. She was a master weaver of modern myths. Last week's triumph had been for a company called Elysian, which sold filtered air in sleek, minimalist canisters. Their tagline, which Ilara herself had conceived in a moment of cynical genius, was *, breathe the intentional. *, the client had been ecstatic. Her boss, Mark, had called her a visionary. She had gone home, sat in her perfectly silent, perfectly designed living room, and felt the crushing weight of her own profound lack of intention. She was selling a story of mindfulness and purpose that she herself could not afford to buy. Her days were a blur of synergistic meetings and brainstorming sessions fueled by overpriced coffee, her vocabulary a weaponized arsenal of corporate jargon, leveraging assets, optimizing engagement, unpacking the core narrative, circle back, touch base, pivot. She moved through this world with a practiced, effortless grace, her sharp blazers and confident smile a costume she donned each morning. No one saw the fault lines spiderwebbing beneath the flawless facade. No one suspected that the visionary creative director felt like a fraud, a ghost haunting the machine of her own success. The evenings were worse. The structured purpose of the workday would dissolve, leaving a gaping void that she would try to fill with the prescribed activities of a successful 30-something. There were gallery openings where she would stare at canvases and nod thoughtfully, her mind a complete blank. There were networking dinners where she would exchange pleasantries and business cards, feeling like an anthropologist studying the bizarre mating rituals of a foreign tribe. There were dates with men who were, like her apartment, impressive on paper, investment bankers, tech entrepreneurs, architects, but the conversations felt like extended job interviews. They would talk about their portfolios, their 5-year plans, their recent trip to Patagonia. They spoke the language of acquisition, of progress, of constant, forward momentum. Ilara would listen, smile, and feel a desperate, unspoken loneliness. They were all climbing their respective ladders, but she was beginning to suspect that all their ladders were leaning against the wrong walls. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would be ambushed by a memory, a flicker of a different kind of life. The scent of yeast and cinnamon, the feel of flour-dusted hands patting her own. Her grandmother, Nana, standing in a sun-drenched kitchen that smelled of baking bread and quiet, unshakable faith. Nana's life had contained none of the elements of modern success. She had lived in a small, cluttered house, worn faded floral aprons, and her greatest treasure was a well-worn Bible with a cracked leather cover. Yet, Alara could not recall a single moment when her grandmother had seemed anything less than profoundly, deeply joyful. Her joy wasn't a product to be marketed or an experience to be curated, it was a spring that welled up from some deep, hidden source. It was a language Alara had once known but had long since forgotten, trading its simple truths for a more complex, and ultimately hollow, corporate syntax. This slow, creeping suffocation had been her reality for years, a low-grade hum of dissatisfaction that she had learned to ignore, to push down with the next promotion, the next bonus, the next beautifully designed object. But recently, the hum had grown into a roar. The quiet ache had become a sharp, insistent pain. The question that had always lurked in the shadows of her mind now stood front and center, demanding an answer. It was a question so simple, so fundamental, that its power terrified her. Is this all there is? Is this meticulously designed, financially secure, critically acclaimed emptiness the grand prize at the end of the race? Is the reward for a life of relentless striving simply a quieter, more tastefully furnished cage? The thought was a betrayal of everything she had worked for, a heresy against the religion of success she had so faithfully practiced. But it would not be silenced. It was the echo in the pristine silence of her life, the one sound she could not tune out, the one flaw in the perfect architecture. It was the frantic, desperate beating of a heart trapped within a beautiful, empty monument. And so, on a Tuesday like any other, as the first, tentative fingers of dawn began to probe the edges of the night sky, Alara stood by the window of her gilded cage, a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands. She watched the river of headlights flowing into the city below, each one a life with a presumed destination. But for the first time, she was not just observing her own detachment. She was acknowledging it. The performance was over. The facade was cracking. She had followed the blueprint to the letter, and it had led her here, to this precipice of quiet desperation. The foundation was trembling. The walls were about to come down. Chapter 1: The Echo in the Silence. The gray light of a Tuesday dawn bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alara's apartment, illuminating a life that looked, by all accounts, perfect. The minimalist furniture was artfully arranged, the chrome appliances in the open-plan kitchen gleamed, and not a single cushion on the pearl-gray sofa was out of place. It was a space curated for a magazine, a testament to success, a monument to order. But for Alara, it was a gilded cage, and the only sound was the low, mournful hum of the refrigerator, a mechanical heartbeat for a home that had no soul. She stood by the window, a ceramic mug of rapidly cooling coffee in her hands, and watched the city yawn to life below. Headlights cut through the pre-dawn gloom, a river of people flowing toward lives of presumed purpose. A banker, a barista, a teacher, a doctor. Everyone seemed to have a destination, a role to play in the grand, chaotic ballet of existence. Everyone but her. At 32, Alara Vance was the creative director at a prestigious marketing firm. She spent her days weaving compelling narratives for products she didn't believe in, designing logos for toothpaste brands that promised wider smiles but delivered only hollow profits. She was good at it. In fact, she was exceptional. Her salary was a comfortable 6 figures, her portfolio was impressive, and her name carried weight in her industry. Yet, each morning, she was greeted by the same profound, gnawing emptiness. An ache in the hollow of her soul that no promotion, no bonus, no beautifully designed object could fill. It was the quiet, persistent question that haunted her waking moments and stalked her dreams. Is this all there is? Her life was a tapestry woven with threads of gray. The gray of her apartment, the gray of the corporate office building, the gray of the rain-slicked streets, the gray of her own muted spirit. She went through the motions, meetings, deadlines, social gatherings where she smiled and nodded in all the right places, but she felt like a ghost haunting her own life, an observer watching a film she had no part in writing. This morning, the ache was sharper, more insistent. It felt like a physical weight on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. She put the coffee down, the bitter taste a reflection of her own internal landscape. Her gaze drifted across the room to a small, forgotten bookshelf tucked into an alcove. It held mostly design annuals and art history tomes, but on the bottom shelf, almost hidden, was a small stack of older, humbler books. On an impulse she couldn't explain, she walked over, her bare feet cold on the polished concrete floor. Her fingers brushed against a worn, leather-bound volume. It was her grandmother's Bible. It had been years since she'd last opened it, a relic from a time when faith was as simple and nourishing as the warm bread Nana used to bake. Her grandmother's faith had been a quiet, unshakable force, a gentle light that had guided her through a life of hardship with grace and joy. Alara, in her pursuit of a modern, successful life, had packed that faith away along with the Bible, deeming it quaint, outdated, and unnecessary. She pulled the book from the shelf. The leather was soft and cracked with age, the pages edged in faded gold. It fell open in her hands to a page that was clearly well read, the paper thin and soft from her grandmother's touch. A single verse was underlined with a faint, wavering pencil line. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. The words seemed to lift from the page, not as ink and paper, but as a living whisper. Hope. A future. The concepts felt alien, like words from a language she had long forgotten. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and sudden. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, painful sound that shattered the pristine silence of her apartment. It was the sound of her own breaking. The carefully constructed walls of her composure, the facade of the successful, put-together woman, crumbled into dust. She sank to the floor, the cold of the concrete seeping into her, and clutched the old Bible to her chest. She didn't have the beautiful, eloquent prayers she remembered from church as a child. All she had was the raw, unfiltered anguish of a lost soul. God? The word was a broken whisper, swallowed by the cavernous room. If you're even there, if you can even hear me. I'm so lost. The tears came freely now, coursing down her cheeks, dripping onto the worn leather cover. I've done everything I was supposed to do. I built this life, this, perfect, empty life. And I am dying inside. There is no color, no joy, no purpose. It's all just gray. Is this the plan you had for me? This hollow echo? She squeezed her eyes shut, the polished image of her life flashing behind them, the boardrooms, the soulless campaigns, the lonely evenings. I can't do this anymore, she wept. I can't keep pretending. I need something more. I need to know what I'm for. Not what my boss needs me for, or what this world expects of me, but what I am for. Why did you make me? Her prayer was not a request, it was a demand born of utter desperation. A surrender. Please, she breathed, her forehead pressed against the book. I give up. I have no answers. I don't know where to go or what to do. Show me. Please, just show me. Give me a sign. A direction. Anything. Just a flicker of light in all this gray. She stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor, for how long she didn't know. The tears subsided, leaving behind a profound stillness, an emptiness that was different from the one before. It was not an ache, it was a space. A quiet, expectant void. And then, it happened. It was not a booming voice or a flash of blinding light. It was quieter, more intimate, and infinitely more powerful. It began as a warmth spreading through her chest, a gentle flame kindling where the icy ache had been. In the theater of her mind, behind her closed eyes, images began to bloom. She saw faces. Not the airbrushed models from her ad campaigns, but real faces, etched with lines of worry, joy, sorrow, and resilience. The face of an elderly woman, her eyes full of stories. The face of a young man, his expression a mixture of fear and hope. The face of a child, her laughter a pure, unblemished sound. She saw their hands, gnarled with arthritis, calloused from hard work, small and soft. Then, she saw her own hands. Not on a keyboard or a mouse, but holding a camera. She saw herself sitting in a worn armchair across from the elderly woman, not interviewing her, but listening. Truly listening, as the woman's story unfolded like a precious, delicate scroll. She saw herself sketching in a notebook, not designing a logo, but capturing the essence of the young man's hopeful gaze. The images coalesced, forming a vision so clear, so vivid, it felt more real than the room around her. She saw a book, no, a collection of stories. Beautifully designed pages where photographs and art were woven together with words. The words were testimonies. Stories of struggle, of faith found in darkness, of small miracles and profound transformations. It was a project that used every ounce of her God-given talent, her eye for design, her feel for narrative, her skill in visual storytelling, but for a purpose that resonated deep within her soul. It was not to sell a product, but to share a truth. To give a voice to the voiceless and to shine a light on the quiet, everyday miracles that so often go unseen. A single word dropped into her mind, clear and perfect as a dewdrop on a leaf. Chronicle. To chronicle their faith. To chronicle their hope. To chronicle his work in their lives. A profound, unshakable peace settled over her, a peace that, as the old scriptures said, surpassed all understanding. The confusion, the desperate searching, the years of feeling adrift, it all vanished, replaced by a singular, breathtaking clarity. This was it. This was what she was for. Slowly, Alara opened her eyes. The gray light of dawn was no longer gray. It was now infused with the softest hues of rose and gold, painting the walls of her apartment with warmth and promise. The low hum of the refrigerator no longer sounded mournful, it was a steady, quiet hum of anticipation. She picked up her forgotten mug of coffee and took a sip. It was cold, but it no longer tasted bitter. It tasted of a new morning, a first step, a future. She had asked for a flicker of light. He had given her the dawn. Chapter 2, The Weight of a New Dawn. The rose and gold of the new day held their fragile beauty for only a moment before the city's relentless pace bleached them back to the familiar, functional gray. But the change had already happened, not in the sky, but within Alara. She remained on the floor for a long time, the old Bible a solid, reassuring weight in her lap, the polished concrete no longer feeling cold but grounding. The vision, the word chronicle, was not fading like a dream. It was settling, taking root in the soil of her soul, as real and tangible as the floor beneath her and the air in her lungs. Finally, with a deliberation that felt foreign to her usually brisk movements, she rose. Her body ached from its time on the hard floor, a pleasant, physical reminder of the spiritual shift that had occurred. She walked into the kitchen, the gleam of chrome and steel no longer intimidating but simply, functional. She opened the refrigerator, its mournful hum now just a sound, and pulled out an apple. The crisp snap as she bit into it was a minor explosion of sensation. The sweetness on her tongue was sharp, clean, real. She was noticing things again. It was as if a filter had been lifted from her senses, allowing the world to rush in, unfiltered and vibrant. The digital clock on the oven blinked 7:15 a.m. A Tuesday. A presentation day. Her old life, the one she had been living just hours ago, waited for her. The thought of stepping back into that role, of putting on the Alara Vance costume, the sharp blazer, the confident smile, the vocabulary of synergistic solutions and brand empowerment, felt like a betrayal of the sacred silence she had just experienced. For a fleeting moment, panic tightened its icy grip around her heart. What had she done? What did this vision even mean? It was insane. Quit her job to wander around taking pictures of strangers? It was the plot of a sentimental film, not a viable life plan. But the panic subsided as quickly as it had arrived, pushed back by the quiet, unshakable peace that now resided where the ache had been. It wasn't a plan yet. It was a direction. A compass point. And for the first time in a decade, she knew which way was north. She dressed for work, the expensive silk blouse feeling like a stranger's clothes against her skin. The entire ritual, the meticulous application of makeup, the selection of understated but costly jewelry, felt like a performance. She was an anthropologist observing the curious customs of a tribe to which she no longer belonged. The office was exactly as she'd left it, a cathedral of muted ambition, smelling of burnt coffee and chilled, recycled air. The low hum of servers was its liturgical chant. Her team greeted her with their usual mix of deference and camaraderie. "Morning, Alara. You ready to knock 'em dead?" asked Liam, her junior designer, his eyes bright with an earnestness she used to find endearing and now found simply sad. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The presentation was for a new luxury brand of bottled water, sourced from a supposedly untouched Arctic spring. The client wanted a campaign that screamed purity, exclusivity, and wellness. Alara's team had outdone themselves. The visuals were stunning, ice blue landscapes, crystalline fonts, and models with skin so flawless it looked like porcelain. The tagline they'd settled on was "Hydration, Elevated." She stood before the sleek boardroom screen, the remote a familiar weight in her hand, and began the well-rehearsed play. The words flowed effortlessly, a script she had memorized through years of practice. She spoke of target demographics, of emotional resonance, of market penetration. She saw the clients nodding, their faces reflecting the pleasant glow of projected profits. Her boss, Mark, gave her a subtle, approving thumbs up. She was, by all accounts, killing it. But she wasn't there. Her mind was filled with the images from her vision, the gnarled, arthritic hands of the elderly woman, the hopeful fear in the young man's eyes. Hands that had worked, prayed, held children, and mourned loved ones. Eyes that had seen hardship and not looked away. What was hydration, elevated compared to the raw, unvarnished truth of a single human life? The entire presentation, the entire industry, suddenly seemed like a colossal, obscene joke. They were spending millions of dollars to convince people to buy a slightly different version of a substance that fell freely from the sky, while real stories of hope and despair went untold. She finished her presentation to a round of enthusiastic applause. "Brilliant, Alara." "Absolutely brilliant," Mark gushed, clapping her on the shoulder. "You've bottled lightning." The irony was lost on him. Alara simply smiled, a polite, vacant curve of her lips. She felt a profound and final detachment. It was the click of a lock, the quiet closing of a door. She could no longer be a part of this. The decision wasn't agonizing, It was a simple statement of fact, as obvious and undeniable as gravity. She excused herself from the celebratory backpatting and walked back to her glass-walled office. She sat down, ignoring the flurry of congratulatory emails popping up on her screen, and looked out the window. The city sprawled below, a concrete and glass testament to human striving. Before, she had seen it as a river of purpose she couldn't join. Now, she saw it as a sea of stories, and she finally had a boat. That evening, she didn't go for drinks with the team to celebrate the win. She went home. The apartment, her perfect monument to order, felt different now. It was a blank canvas. She bypassed the living room and went straight to the large storage closet at the end of the hall, a space she rarely entered. It held seasonal decorations she never used and relics from her past life. Behind a stack of portfolio cases from college, she found it, a sturdy, black pelican case. Dust puffed into the air as she unlatched the clasps. Inside, nestled in the custom-cut foam, was her old DSLR camera. It was a Canon 5D Mark II, a professional workhorse from a decade ago, long since overshadowed by newer, sleeker models. She had bought it with the first significant paycheck from her very first design job, convincing herself it was for creative exploration, but had soon abandoned it for the faster, more lucrative demands of her career. She lifted it from the case. The cool, textured magnesium alloy body felt solid, real, an extension of her own hand. It had a comforting weight that her minimalist life had meticulously eliminated. She attached the lens she loved most, a 50mm f/1.4 prime lens, simple and honest, perfect for portraits. She raised the camera to her eye, the world framed and focused through the viewfinder. She pointed it at the Bible, which she had placed on her coffee table. Through the lens, the cracked leather and faded gold lettering took on a profound character. She pressed the shutter. The sound, a confident, mechanical thwack click, was the most beautiful thing she had heard all day. It was the sound of a promise being kept. The sound of a beginning. The camera felt like an old friend, patiently waiting for her return. Her hands, so accustomed to the smooth, sterile surfaces of a trackpad and a smartphone, reacquainted themselves with the dials and buttons, the muscle memory returning with surprising speed. She spent the next hour just holding it, feeling its weight, looking through its eye, re-establishing a connection that had been severed for too long. Then, she knew what the next step was. She grabbed her purse and left the apartment. She walked several blocks to a small, independent art supply store she hadn't visited in years. The bell above the door chimed, and she was greeted by the beloved smell of paper, graphite, and turpentine. It was the scent of creation. She ran her fingers over textured watercolor papers, browsed pigments in 1,000 hues, and finally found what she was looking for. She bought a large, unlined sketchbook with a thick, black cover and a set of fine-tipped archival ink pens. It was a simple purchase, but it felt monumental. It was an investment in the unseen. A tangible commitment to the vision. Back in her apartment, she cleared a space on her vast, empty white desk. For years, the only thing on it had been her sleek laptop and a single, artfully placed succulent. Now, she pushed the laptop aside. In the center of the desk, she placed her grandmother's Bible. To the right, her old Canon camera. To the left, the new, unopened sketchbook and the ink pens. They looked out of place in the curated perfection of the room. The Bible was old, the camera was functional and worn, the sketchbook was brimming with blank, unwritten potential. They were objects of substance, not of style. They were her new tools. Her true north. The gray evening light filled the room, but it did not touch the small altar she had created on her desk. Alara looked at the three items, the source of faith, the instrument of vision, and the vessel for stories, and a deep, quiet joy bloomed in her chest. The gnawing question, "Is this all there is?" had been answered. No, this was not all. This was just the beginning. Chapter 3, The First Page. The morning arrived not with the shrill command of an alarm, but with the soft, pearlescent light of an overcast sky filtering through the vast windows. Alara awoke with a clarity that felt startlingly new. There was no groggy negotiation with the day, no mental tally of meetings and deadlines. There was only a quiet hum of purpose, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the desk across the room, where the Bible, camera, and sketchbook kept their silent vigil. Foregoing her usual austere breakfast of black coffee and a protein bar, she made toast, spreading it thickly with butter and jam she'd found in the back of a cupboard. She ate slowly, deliberately, seated at her dining table, actually tasting the simple, satisfying combination of crunch, salt, and sweetness. This was not fuel for a high-performance machine, it was nourishment for a human being. She dressed not in silk and tailored wool, but in dark, comfortable jeans, a soft gray jumper, and worn leather boots that had been relegated to the back of her closet for years. They felt like her own skin. She packed the sketchbook and pens into a simple canvas satchel, then hesitated. Finally, she picked up the Canon. The weight of it was substantial, a physical anchor to her new resolve. She slung the strap over her shoulder, the body of the camera resting reassuringly against her hip. She looked at her reflection in the hall mirror, no makeup, her hair pulled back simply, her eyes clear. The woman looking back was not Alara Vance, creative director. It was just Alara. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. The journey to the office was a final pilgrimage through a life that was no longer hers. The sterile, air-conditioned carriage of the train, the sea of averted eyes glued to screens, the muted symphony of corporate striving, it all felt like a foreign film she was watching without subtitles. She felt no sadness, no regret, only a detached sort of pity for the person she had been, running so hard in a race she hadn't even chosen. Mark's office door was open. He was on the phone, laughing, one hand gesturing expansively. He saw her and waved her in, finishing his call with a booming, "We'll circle back and touch base." "Ciao." He beamed at her. "Alara. The woman of the hour." The client is ecstatic. They're talking about fast-tracking the whole campaign. We're going to win awards for this. I'm thinking Cannes. That's great, Mark, she said, her voice even and calm. I'm glad they're happy. She placed a white envelope on the gleaming surface of his mahogany desk. His smile faltered, replaced by a look of bemused confusion. What's this? An expense report? Just give it to finance. It's my resignation, she said. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Mark stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He looked up at her, his eyes scanning her face, her clothes. He was trying to compute, to fit this new data into his established framework of her. And failing. This is a joke, right? A negotiating tactic? You want a bigger title? Vice President? Done. A bigger bonus? Name your number. Don't be ridiculous, Alara. We just landed the biggest account of the year. It's not about money or a title, Mark. It's not about this job or this company. It's about me. I need to do something else. He leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning in protest. He steepled his fingers, a gesture she knew was meant to project thoughtful authority but now just looked like a flimsy defense. Something else? What, is our rival headhunting you? Did Omnicorp make you an offer? His tone was laced with the professional paranoia that fueled their industry. No. No one made me an offer. I'm not going to another agency. Then what? The question exploded from him, a raw burst of incomprehension. You're at the top of your game. People would kill for your job. What could you possibly be going to do? She thought of the sketchbook, the camera, the word chronicle. How could she explain it in a language he would understand? Synergistic soul-searching? A pivot to authentic narrative actualization? The corporate lexicon had no words for this. I'm going to be a photographer, she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberatingly simple. Mark stared at her. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a kind sound. A photographer? Elara, we hire photographers. We pay them a fortune for a day's work and then they go back to their little studios. It's a job, a trade. It's not a career for someone like you. Maybe it is, she said softly. She slid her company ID card and key across the desk to sit beside the envelope. My work is finished, and I've left detailed transition notes for Liam. He's more than capable. I wish you all the best. She turned and walked out, not waiting for a reply. She could feel his incredulous stare burning into her back. As she passed her old office, her team looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Liam started to get up, but she just gave him a small, reassuring smile and a nod, and kept walking. She didn't stop at her desk. There was nothing there she wanted. She walked past the reception desk, through the shimmering glass doors, and into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, sealing her off from the world of hydration, elevated, she felt not a loss, but an unburdening. The weight of expectation, of ambition, of a life built on the wrong foundations, simply fell away. When the elevator doors opened onto the lobby, she was walking into a new world. The city air hit her, thick with the smells of exhaust fumes, roasting nuts from a street vendor, and the damp chill of the approaching autumn. It was chaotic and alive. Instead of heading for the train station, she turned and started to walk, with no destination in mind. She let the currents of the crowd carry her. For the first time, she wasn't striding with purpose towards a meeting, she was drifting, observing. She saw a young couple arguing passionately on a corner, their hands flying. She saw a bike messenger weaving through traffic with a look of serene focus. She saw a woman sitting on a bench, expertly applying lipstick without a mirror. Each was a story, a fleeting moment of unscripted life. After an hour, she found herself descending a flight of worn stone steps into the cavernous mouth of a subway station. The air changed, growing cooler, filled with the rumble of approaching trains and the scent of steel dust and popcorn. Down on the platform, the river of humanity flowed thick and fast. It was here, in this subterranean crossroads, that the city's facade was stripped away. Here, people were not their job titles, they were just tired, hopeful, hurried, and lost. And then she heard it. The sound was thin and reedy at first, a fragile melody threading its way through the cacophony. It was a violin. She followed the sound to a tiled alcove between two stairwells. An old man stood there, his back to the grimy wall, his eyes closed. He must have been in his late 70s, his face a magnificent roadmap of wrinkles, a fine white beard tracing the line of his jaw. He wore a patched tweed coat despite the mildness of the day. But it was his hands that captured her. They were gnarled with arthritis, the knuckles swollen and prominent, yet they moved over the fingerboard and the bow with an impossible, practiced grace. The music he played was achingly sad and beautiful, a folk melody that spoke of lost homelands and long-forgotten loves. People rushed past, a few tossing coins into the open violin case at his feet, most utterly oblivious. He didn't seem to notice. He was not performing for them, he was communing with something deep inside himself. Alara stood and listened, mesmerized, for 3 whole songs. This was it. This was the raw, unvarnished truth. This was a story. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She slowly lifted the camera. Her hands, so confident with a design remote just yesterday, felt clumsy. She framed the shot, focusing on his hands, the worn wood of the violin, the horsehair of the bow. But it felt wrong. It felt like stealing. The song ended, its final note hanging in the grimy air before being swallowed by the roar of an arriving train. The old man opened his eyes. They were a pale, watery blue, and they seemed to hold a profound weariness, but also a flicker of something indestructible. He looked directly at her, at the camera in her hands. She lowered it, her face flushing. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the noise. "Your music, it's beautiful." He gave a slight, formal bow of his head. "Thank you, miss." His voice was raspy, with an accent she couldn't place. She began, her courage failing. "I'm a photographer. I'm starting a project, to chronicle stories. Of people. Real people." The words sounded pretentious and foolish. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. "Would you mind," she forced herself to continue, "if I took your portrait?" He considered this for a long moment, his pale eyes studying her. She expected a refusal, a demand for money, a dismissal. Instead, a small, weary smile touched his lips. "The face is old," he said. "But the story is older. If you think it is worth telling." Relief washed over her, so potent it made her feel lightheaded. "It is," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised her. "It absolutely is." He nodded and closed his eyes again, lifting the violin back to his chin. He didn't pose. He simply began to play another melody, just for himself. Alara raised the camera, her hands steady now. The world narrowed to the rectangle of the viewfinder. She saw the light from the platform fixtures catching the silver in his beard, the deep crevices of his closed eyelids, the passionate, painful grace of his fingers on the strings. She adjusted the focus, a minute turn of the lens. Everything else fell away, the rushing crowds, the rumbling train, the ghost of her former life. There was only this man and his music. She pressed the shutter button. The sound, that solid, mechanical thwack click, cut through the noise of the station. It was not an ending this time. It was not a promise. It was an act. It was the first word written on the first page. Chapter 4, The Chronicle Begins. The click was a punctuation mark in the station's roaring, run-on sentence. For a beat, it felt impossibly loud to Alara, a sharp-edged sound that had severed something, a trespass and a sacrament all at once. The world rushed back in, the squeal of the train's brakes, a distant shout, the murmur of 100 conversations, but the moment after the shutter's release remained, suspended in the air between her and the old violinist. He finished his melody, letting the final, sorrowful note vibrate into the grimy air until it was consumed by the station's noise. He lowered the bow slowly, with a reverence that suggested he was putting a sacred object to rest. His pale blue eyes opened and found her again. There was no anger in them, no suspicion. There was only a profound, bottomless weariness and a quiet question. Alara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was the moment where the Alara of yesterday would have offered a tight, polite smile and melted back into the crowd, her transaction complete. But that Alara was a ghost. This new Alara, the one holding a heavy camera and a fragile sense of purpose, stayed rooted to the spot. She took a hesitant step forward, lowering the camera so it hung from its strap, no longer a barrier between them. That was I don't have the words for how beautiful that was. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or gratification, passed across his wrinkled face. The words are in the music, he rasped, his voice a low gravel. You just have to listen. I am listening, she said, surprising herself with her own earnestness. My name is Alara. I told you I'm starting a project, a chronicle. A photograph is just the cover of the book. I was hoping you might tell me the title. He looked down at his violin, his gnarled fingers caressing the polished wood as if it were a living thing. The gesture was full of a love so deep it was almost painful to watch. The title changes with the day, he said, looking back at her. Today, perhaps it is Memory of the Black Forest. It sounds like a sad memory. All the best ones are, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It did not reach his eyes. They are the ones that prove you have truly lived. That you have loved something worth losing. The noise of the platform seemed to fade, the rushing people becoming a blurred backdrop. Alara felt as if they were standing in a small, quiet room of their own creation. May I ask your name? Mikhail, he said. Mikhail, she repeated, tasting the name. And where is that music from, Mikhail? The Black Forest? He shook his head slowly. The music is from a place that is no longer on the map. A village nestled in a valley. The forest was on one side, a river on the other. Now, the forest is ash and the river has a different name. But the music remembers. Alara thought of the sterile conference rooms where she had spent a decade of her life, fighting battles over shades of blue and the placement of a logo. The sheer, staggering weight of this man's quiet dignity, of a loss so profound it had erased his home from the earth, was overwhelming. And your violin? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. It looks as old as the story. Older, Mikhail said, his gaze softening as he looked at it. This was my Anya's last gift to me, before the soldiers came. She sold her mother's wedding ring to buy it. She said my hands were made for this, not for holding a rifle or a shovel. She said that as long as I could play, a part of our home would still be alive. He paused, swallowing. When I play, she is not so far away. Her face, it becomes clear again. Alara felt a stinging in her eyes. This was the raw, unvarnished truth she had been searching for. It wasn't a brand narrative or a marketing angle. It was the bedrock of a human life, laid bare in a subway station for anyone willing to stop and listen. She reached into her satchel, her hand bypassing the small change in a side pocket and going straight for her wallet. She pulled out a crisp $50 bill. She held it out to him. For your time, she said, feeling the inadequacy of the words, of the gesture. For the story. Mikhail looked at the money, then back at her face. He did not reach for it immediately. The story is free, miss. It costs nothing to share what you carry. The music, he added, with that same weary smile, the music asks for a little help with the rent. He finally took the bill with 2 fingers, folded it carefully, and tucked it deep into his coat pocket without a glance. It was not a dismissal, but an acceptance of a necessary, worldly transaction that was entirely separate from the sacred one they had just shared. He lifted his violin again. You have your picture? Yes, she said. Thank you. Then go, he said, not unkindly. Go and write its story. Do not let it become just another silent face. He placed the instrument under his chin, closed his eyes, and the first notes of another haunting melody began to rise, weaving a spell of heartbreaking beauty against the indifferent concrete and steel. Alara stood for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, the music following her like a ghost. She ascended the steps back into the daylight, feeling as if she were surfacing from a deep dive, her ears still ringing with the pressure of the depths. The city was the same, the blaring horns, the hurrying crowds, the scent of street food and decay. But she was not. Something had been recalibrated inside her. She walked for another 20 minutes, on autopilot, her mind replaying the conversation, the look in Mikhail's eyes, the way his fingers moved. She found herself in front of a small, anonymous cafe, tucked between a laundromat and a mobile phone store. On impulse, she went inside. The warmth and the rich, dark smell of roasting coffee beans enveloped her. It was a haven of quiet normalcy. She ordered a black coffee, her old habit, but this time it felt different. It was a conscious choice, a comforting ritual, not a desperate injection of caffeine. She found a small table in the corner, by a window streaked with rain that had just begun to fall. She set the canvas satchel on the chair beside her. For a long moment, she just watched the raindrops chase each other down the glass, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of gray and neon. Then, with a steady hand, she reached into her bag and took out the camera. She switched it on. The small screen lit up. She navigated to the last image taken. And there he was. The portrait was more than she could have hoped for. The station's harsh fluorescent light had become, through the lens, a kind of stage lighting. It caught the silver in his beard, the deep, shadowed hollows of his closed eyes, the almost translucent skin stretched over the knuckles of his left hand as it held the neck of the violin. It was a study in contrasts, the fragility of old age and the unyielding strength of his passion. The face was old, he had said, but the story was older. In the photograph, you could see it. You could see the lost villages, the forgotten rivers, the ghost of a woman named Anya. It was all there, etched into the lines of his face. Her breath caught in her throat. She set the camera gently on the table. Then, she took out the sketchbook and her favorite fountain pen. She opened it to the first blank page. The crisp, clean paper seemed to hold a world of possibility. She looked from the image on the camera screen to the empty page and back again. Do not let it become just another silent face. Mikhail's parting words echoed in her mind. This was the second part of the act. The image was the evidence, the words were the testimony. She uncapped the pen. The nib touched the paper. And with a clarity that felt like coming home, Alara began to write. His name was Mikhail. Chapter 5, The Weaver of Lost Colors. The words were not a report, they were an incantation. Alara wrote with a fierce, quiet urgency, as if the story might evaporate if she paused for breath. The cheap coffee grew cold beside her, forgotten. The rain pattered a soft, percussive rhythm against the glass, a soundtrack to her thoughts. Her fountain pen, a sleek black instrument that had once signed off on million-dollar marketing campaigns, now felt like an extension of her own pulse. It scratched a frantic, yet graceful, rhythm across the page. His name was Mikhail. But a name is just a label for the vessel. The man I met was a cartographer of sorrow, a keeper of a country that lived only in the muscle memory of his fingers. He spoke of a village nestled between a forest and a river, a place erased by the brutal geometry of war. He did not say, my home was destroyed. He said, the forest is ash and the river has a different name. The loss was so total it had rewritten the land itself, *. She paused, her fingers aching slightly. She looked at the photograph on her camera's small screen. The closed eyes, the rapturous pain on his face. She felt a profound responsibility, a weight heavier than any deadline she had ever faced. She was not just captioning an image, she was trying to translate the sound of a violin she could no longer hear, the memory of a woman named Anya she had never met. His violin was his last link. A gift from his wife, Anya, bought with the memory of a marriage, her mother's ring. A trade of one sacred object for another. She told him his hands were for music, not for weapons. A prophecy and a prayer. And now, he plays in the echoing underbelly of the city, not for money, not really, but to conjure a ghost. When I play, he told me, her face, it becomes clear again. He plays to remember her smile. He plays to keep his world from disappearing completely. The writing was a fever. It poured out of her, raw and unedited, a torrent of empathy and observation that she had dammed up for a decade. She filled one page, then another. The sterile, objective language of her former life was shed like a skin. Here, in the quiet corner of an anonymous cafe, she found her real voice. It was a voice that cared more for the tremor in an old man's words than for a brand's quarterly earnings. It was the voice of the Alara she had always hoped to be. When she finally lifted the pen, the cafe seemed to have grown dimmer. The rain had slowed to a fine, misty drizzle, and the late afternoon light was failing. A profound exhaustion settled over her, but it was a good kind of tired, the satisfying ache of a muscle well used. She read back what she had written. It was flawed, emotional, perhaps even sentimental. But it was true. It felt more true than any market analysis report she had ever produced. She had not let Mikhail become a silent face. She had given his silence a voice. She capped her pen, closed the sketchbook, and finally took a sip of the cold coffee. It was bitter, but she barely noticed. A new feeling was dawning alongside the exhaustion, a quiet, humming excitement. This was real. This was the work. It wasn't just a flight of fancy, a rebellion against a life she hated. It was a beginning. Her gaze drifted out the rain-streaked window again. The world, once a blurred backdrop to her own anxieties, now seemed full of nascent stories. Every person hurrying by under an umbrella was a potential chronicle. But it was the building directly opposite that held her attention, the laundromat. Its fluorescent lights cast a stark, clinical glow onto the damp pavement. Through the large glass front, she could see the rows of stainless steel machines, spinning and tumbling like captive moons. It was a place of mundane ritual, a non-space where people waited, suspended between one part of their day and the next. And in the midst of it all, there was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 20. She was sitting on a hard plastic chair, legs tucked under her, a book open in her lap. But she wasn't reading. Her attention was fixed on the churning drum of a washing machine. Alara watched as the girl reached into a large, overflowing bag at her feet and pulled out a tangled skein of brightly colored yarn, a brilliant, defiant crimson. With nimble fingers, she began to untangle it, her movements precise and hypnotic. As the clothes tumbled and spun behind the glass door of the machine, a vortex of muted blues, grays, and whites, the girl methodically worked the knot out of the crimson thread, winding it carefully into a neat ball. The contrast was striking. The sterile, impersonal environment of the laundromat, the drab colors of the laundry, and this young woman, patiently, lovingly, untangling a single, vibrant thread of red. It was a small, quiet act of creation in a place of cleansing. An act of bringing order to chaos. Alara felt the familiar click, not from her camera, but inside her chest. The same pull she had felt when she first heard Mikhail's violin. It was a quiet insistence, a curiosity that bordered on compulsion. Who was she? Why was she untangling yarn in a laundromat? Was she a weaver? A knitter? What stories were coiled in that crimson thread? The rain stopped. A weak, watery ray of late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, striking the laundromat's window and making the spinning machines glitter. It felt like a signal. Go and write its story. Mikhail's words again. They were becoming her mantra. Without a second thought, Alara packed her sketchbook and pen back into her satchel. She left a $5 bill on the table for the coffee, slung the bag over one shoulder and the camera over the other, and pushed open the cafe door. The city exhaled a damp, metallic breath of post-rain air. The streets were slick and reflective, mirroring the bruised purple and orange of the twilight sky. She crossed the street, the worn leather of her boots making soft sounds on the wet asphalt. The hum of the laundromat grew louder as she approached. As she reached for the door, she hesitated for just a beat. This was different from Mikhail. He had been performing, putting his art out into the world. This girl was in a private moment, an unguarded interlude in her day. It felt like a greater intrusion. The Alara of yesterday would have turned around. The Alara of today pushed the door open. A wave of warm, humid air, smelling of soap and hot metal, washed over her. The rhythmic thumping of the machines was a mechanical heartbeat. The girl looked up from her crimson yarn, her concentration broken by the chime of the door. Her eyes were a startlingly clear shade of green, wide and questioning. They held a flicker of wariness, the innate caution of a young woman alone in the city. Alara offered a small, disarming smile. She let the camera hang by her side, not as a tool, but as an explanation. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Alara began, her voice feeling too loud in the rumbling quiet. "I was in the cafe across the street. I couldn't help but notice what you were doing." She gestured towards the vibrant ball of yarn now resting in the girl's lap. "It's a beautiful color." The girl's gaze dropped to the yarn, then back to Alara's face. The wariness didn't vanish, but it softened around the edges. "Thanks," she said. Her voice was soft, with a slight, unplaceable accent. "I'm trying to salvage it. It got tangled with everything else." "Salvage it for what?" Alara asked gently, taking a step closer. The girl cradled the yarn in her hands. "A project. I mend things." The simple words hung in the air, imbued with a significance that resonated deep within Alara. I mend things, it was what Alara was trying to do for herself, for the stories she was finding. She felt the connection, a fragile thread forming between them in the soapy air. "My name is Alara," she said, finally raising the camera just an inch, a silent question. "I'm working on a project, too. A chronicle of people in the city. I take a photograph, and I write their story. I was wondering, could I maybe hear a little of yours?" Chapter 6, The Mender of Small Tears. The girl, Lena, she would later learn her name was, looked at Alara as if she were a puzzle to be solved. The hum of the washing machines filled the silence between them, a low, constant thrum that seemed to measure out the seconds of her hesitation. Her hands, which had moved with such fluid grace over the crimson yarn, were now still in her lap, guarding the vibrant ball of wool. "A story," she repeated, the words quiet, barely rising above the rhythmic slosh of water and tumbling clothes. I don't really have a story." It was the standard deflection, the modesty of those who don't see the poetry in their own lives. Alara had heard it before, in corporate boardrooms and on city streets. But here, in the warm, soap-scented air, it felt different. It wasn't a dismissal, it was a genuine question of her own significance. "Everyone has a story," Alara said softly, her voice pitched to be an island of calm in the mechanical sea. She decided against hiding behind her camera. Instead, she took a seat on the plastic chair 2 units down, creating a space of shared waiting rather than a dynamic of interviewer and subject. "You said you mend things. That's a story right there. Most people just throw things away." Lena's gaze dropped to the yarn, a flicker of something, pride, perhaps, or just acknowledgement, in her clear green eyes. It seems a waste not to. A hole isn't an ending. It's just an interruption. The phrase hung in the air, perfect and profound. An interruption. Alara felt a tremor of recognition. Her own life hadn't ended when she walked out of her office, it had been interrupted. She was in the space between, trying to mend the tear between the person she was and the person she wanted to be. I felt the same way about the man I photographed yesterday, Alara found herself explaining, wanting to offer a piece of her own story in trade. He plays the violin in the subway. An old man named Mikhail. He plays to remember his wife. Every note he plays is a way of mending the silence she left behind. I wrote about him. She gestured to the satchel at her feet. That's my project. Finding the people who are mending the interruptions. Lena listened, her head tilted slightly. The wariness in her eyes was dissolving, replaced by a thoughtful curiosity. The shared language of mending had become a bridge between them. Mikhail, she murmured, testing the name. I think I've seen him. Near the station with the blue tiles. His music, it sounds like it's raining, even on a sunny day. That's him, Alara confirmed, a smile breaking across her face. That's exactly it. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the laundromats rhythmed their new soundtrack. Lena picked up the yarn again, her fingers resuming their hypnotic work, a sign of trust. So, what do you mend? Alara asked, her tone gentle. Small things. Mostly for people in my building, Lena said. Mrs. Gable's tea towels, the ones her mother embroidered. They're so thin you can see the light through them. I use a single thread to reinforce the fabric from behind so the flowers don't fall apart. Or Mr. Henderson's old fishing sweater. The elbows were gone. He told me he wore it the day he caught the biggest pike of his life. So I didn't just patch it with wool, I used a waxed sailmaker's thread, like the kind he uses for his lines. To keep the memory strong. Alara was captivated. This wasn't just darning. This was a form of archival, of applied empathy. Lena didn't just fix the object, she honored its history. She was a curator of personal artifacts, a weaver of lost colors and forgotten moments. You're not just mending the fabric, Alara whispered, more to herself than to Lena. You're mending the story that goes with it. Lena looked up, and for the first time, a real smile touched her lips. It was a small, radiant thing. Yes. That's it. You get it. The tear is just the punctuation. The story is what matters. She held up the ball of crimson yarn. It was almost perfectly untangled now, a sphere of pure, vibrant potential. This was my grandmother's scarf. She taught me to knit with it. Her hands were always cold, and she loved red. She said it was a brave color. Was? Alara asked, catching the past tense. She passed away 2 years ago. The scarf, it just started to unravel a few months back. One loose thread, and then. Lena gestured with her hands, a gesture of gentle collapse. I couldn't bear to see it disappear. Oh, I'm unraveling it completely. I'm going to use the yarn to knit a pair of gloves for a little girl in my building whose family just arrived from somewhere cold. So my grandmother's brave color gets a new story. A new pair of hands to keep warm. The sheer, quiet beauty of the act struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. It was a perfect cycle of memory, grief, and rebirth, all contained in a single skein of yarn in a noisy laundromat. This was the work. This was the pulse of the city she had been searching for. Not in the headlines or the stock tickers, but here, in the small, deliberate acts of preservation and kindness. Lena, Alara said, her voice thick with emotion. Can I take your picture now? I want to remember this. Lena looked from the yarn to Alara's camera, and then back to Alara's face. She nodded, a simple, trusting gesture. Alara didn't ask her to pose. She didn't want a portrait of a girl in a laundromat. She wanted a portrait of the mender. She raised the camera, her movements slow and deliberate. The lens found focus not on Lena's face, but on her hands. The young, capable fingers cradling the sphere of crimson wool. In the background, the out-of-focus churn of a washing machine, a vortex of muted clothes, provided the perfect counterpoint. The fluorescent lights of the laundromat, which had seemed so harsh and clinical before, now acted as a studio light, catching the texture of the yarn and the determined grace in the curl of Lena's fingers. Click. The sound of the shutter was a soft, final note in the room's mechanical symphony. Alara took a few more shots. One of Lena's face, finally, her expression serene and focused on her work. Another of the overflowing bag of mending projects at her feet, a testament to the trust her neighbors placed in her. Each photo felt true, each one a stanza in the poem of this quiet girl. As Alara lowered her camera, a loud buzz cut through the air. A dryer in the corner had finished its cycle. The interruption, both mundane and final. Lena began to gather her things, her private moment concluded. She carefully placed the ball of crimson yarn into a separate cloth bag, treating it like a precious jewel. Thank you, Alara said. For sharing that. Thank you for listening, Lena replied, shouldering her bag. It was nice to say it out loud. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and looked back at Alara. The questioning look was back in her eyes, but this time it was directed at Alara. You said you're finding people who are mending the interruptions, Lena said, her voice clear and direct. So, can I ask? What are you mending? The question landed with unnerving precision. Alara felt her breath catch. No one had asked her that. Not her parents, not her few remaining friends. They had only asked what she was doing, as if her life were a series of tasks to be completed. But Lena, a stranger she'd known for less than an hour, had seen straight to the heart of it. Alara thought of the sterile glass tower she had left behind, the hollow echo of her own voice in meaningless meetings, the decade-long tear in her own soul. A wasted decade, Alara answered, the words coming out with a stark honesty that surprised her. I'm trying to mend the time I lost, pretending to be someone else. Lena nodded slowly, a deep and ancient understanding in her young eyes. It was the look of someone who knew the value of salvaging what was important. That's a big project, she said, not with pity, but with respect. You'll need a lot of thread. And with that, she smiled again, a quick, bright flash, and then she was gone, the chime of the door announcing her departure. Alara sat alone on the hard plastic chair. The laundromat suddenly felt vast and quiet, despite the continued rumbling of the machines. She lifted her camera and looked at the image on the small screen. The photo of Lena's hands. It was perfect. The vibrant, orderly sphere of crimson yarn, a symbol of salvaged memory and future warmth, held against the chaotic, impersonal backdrop of the spinning machine. It was a story of hope in a place of transition. It was the second entry in her chronicle. She felt a deep, resonant calm settle over her. She had crossed the street on an impulse, a fragile thread of curiosity. And she had found not just a story, but a kindred spirit. A mender of small tears, who had, in the space of a laundry cycle, helped patch one of her own. Chapter 7, The Weaver's Knot. The gallery wasn't a gallery, not in the sterile, white-walled sense Alara had once known. It was a reclaimed space above a bookshop, with floors of scarred, honey-colored wood that creaked with the weight of stories. The air smelled of old paper, dust motes dancing in the amber light of the late afternoon sun slanting through a large arched window. It was here, in this haven of the second-hand and the well-loved, that Alara chose to display her work. 3 months had passed since her encounter with Lena in the laundromat. 3 months of chasing threads through the city's labyrinthine streets. Her project, once a nebulous concept, had solidified into a small, potent collection she called the Menders. There were only a dozen portraits, each printed large on heavy, textured paper that felt like canvas. Beneath each image, a small card held Alara's words, a paragraph or two capturing the essence of the story she had been told. She stood near the entrance, her camera bag at her feet, feeling a nervous hum under her skin that was entirely different from the anxiety of a corporate presentation. This was the vulnerability of bearing a piece of her soul. Mikhail was the first to arrive. He came not with his violin case, but with a small, shy woman leaning on his arm, her eyes wide and silver gray. "Alara," he said, his voice a familiar, gentle rumble. "This is Sophia. My Sophia." Alara's breath caught. He spoke the name as if she were standing right there. She looked at the woman, who offered a small, hesitant smile. "My granddaughter," Mikhail clarified, his eyes twinkling. "Named for her." He led Sophia to his portrait. It was a close-up, his eyes closed in concentration, the weathered wood of his violin tucked beneath his chin, his bow a blur of motion. Alara had captured the rain on a sunny day. Sophia traced the outline of her grandfather's face on the photograph. "It looks just like he does when he's talking to Grandma," she whispered. Mikhail patted her hand, his gaze finding Alara's across the room. It was a look of profound gratitude, a thank you that needed no words. Then, Lena appeared. She slipped into the room so quietly Alara almost missed her. She was wearing a simple gray dress, but around her neck was a splash of vibrant color, a thin, intricately knitted scarf of the most brilliant crimson. The brave color. She didn't look at Alara at first. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the other portraits, a clockmaker with hands like spiders, a restorer of porcelain dolls, a bookbinder surrounded by the scent of leather and glue. Her gaze finally landed on her own portrait, the one of her hands. Alara had chosen it as the centerpiece of the small exhibition. The sphere of salvaged yarn, a perfect world of memory and potential. Lena stood before it for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, she slowly lifted her own hands, mirroring the pose in the photograph. Alara watched as a young girl, no older than 7, with bright, curious eyes, came to stand beside Lena. The girl was wearing a pair of crimson gloves. The girl pointed to the picture. "That's your yarn, Lena." "It was," Lena said softly, her eyes now on the girl. "Now it's your gloves." The simple exchange was the entire story, spoken aloud. Lena finally looked up and met Alara's eyes. Her smile was no longer the small, radiant thing Alara remembered. It was broader now, more confident. A shared understanding flowed between them, a recognition that they were both part of something larger than themselves. The room began to fill, a murmur of conversation rising to a low, pleasant hum. Friends of the subjects, curious bookshop patrons, a few local art bloggers Alara had nervously emailed. She was explaining the story of the doll restorer to an interested couple when a familiar voice cut through the noise. "Alara? My God, is that you?" She turned. "David." From her old firm. He stood there in a perfectly tailored suit, his hair artfully disheveled, a look of bemused surprise on his face. He represented everything she had left behind, the casual confidence, the language of profit margins and deliverables, the air of someone perpetually on their way to a more important meeting. David, she said, her voice even. What are you doing here? My wife is obsessed with this bookshop. I was just killing time. His eyes swept the room, a flicker of polite condescension in his gaze. So this is your project? Photography. Good for you. Finding a hobby. Hobby. The word stung, a casual dismissal of the most meaningful work she had ever done. The old Alara would have shrunk, would have felt the need to justify herself, to frame it in terms of marketability or as a portfolio-building exercise. But she was not the old Alara. It's not a hobby, David, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It's my work. He gestured to the portraits. Right. So, what's the angle? Gritty urban decay? The forgotten masses? There might be a corporate sponsorship play in it if you frame it as a social responsibility initiative. He was trying to put it in a box he understood, to translate it back into the language of the world she'd abandoned. And in that moment, Alara understood. The tear she had been mending wasn't a wasted decade. Lena had been wrong. It wasn't that big a project. The interruption was the illusion that this world, David's world, was the only one that mattered. There's no angle, Alara said, and for the first time, she felt a genuine pang of pity for him. They're just stories. About people who fix things. David gave a non-committal shrug, already losing interest. Well, looks great. We should grab lunch sometime, catch up. He handed her a business card, a crisp, embossed rectangle of her former life, and melted back into the crowd. Alara looked down at the card. David Chen, Senior Vice President, Strategic Development. It felt like a relic from another civilization. She didn't tear it up. Tearing it would be an act of anger, of rejection. Instead, she slipped it into her pocket. It was a part of her story, too. A thread, however coarse, in the larger tapestry. Later, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the gallery emptied, only Mikhail, Sophia, and Lena remained. Mikhail, at Alara's urging, had brought his violin after all. He sat on a wooden stool beneath the arched window and began to play. It wasn't the sad, rain-filled music of the subway. It was a soft, gentle melody, a lullaby that seemed to gather all the stories in the room and hold them in its embrace. Lena came to stand beside Alara, both of them watching him. He's mending the silence, Lena said, echoing Alara's own words from their first meeting. We all are, Alara replied. In our own way. She looked at her collection, at the faces on the walls, at the two quiet figures beside her. She remembered Lena's question, what are you mending? She finally had the real answer. I thought I was mending lost time, Alara said, her voice barely a whisper over the violin's song. But I was wrong. I wasn't mending a hole. I was weaving. Lena tilted her head, a familiar, curious gesture. All those years in my old job, Alara explained, I learned how to manage a project. How to find the core of a message. How to tell a story that would make people listen. I thought I was wasting my life, but I was just spinning the thread. This, she gestured around the room, at the photos, the text, the people, this is what I was spinning it for. It was the final, satisfying click of a puzzle piece falling into place. Nothing was wasted. The decade wasn't a tear to be patched over, but a vast supply of strong, durable thread she had unknowingly been creating. The person she had been was the one who made it possible to honor the person she was becoming. Lena nodded, her deep, knowing gaze seeming to understand everything. That's the best kind of mending, she said. When you realize the two pieces were always meant to be joined. It's not a patch. It's a seam. Mikhail's melody drew to a close, the last note hanging in the dusty, golden air like a perfect, luminous pearl. Silence descended, but it wasn't empty. It was full of connection, of stories shared and honored. Alara picked up her camera. She looked at Mikhail, his face serene in the twilight, his granddaughter asleep on his shoulder. She looked at Lena, whose crimson scarf was a line of courage against the fading light. These were her people. Her kindred spirits. They were not subjects anymore, they were a part of her story, and she a part of theirs. She had not just documented the menders, she had become one of them, using her lens and her words to stitch the small, vital narratives of the city together. She raised the camera, not to her eye, but holding it at her side. She didn't need to take another picture. She was no longer just an observer. She was in the frame now. She had tied the final, sturdy knot, a weaver's knot that bound her past to her present, her work to her heart. And she knew, with a certainty that was as warm and solid as the crimson yarn, that this was not an ending. It was just the beginning of the most beautiful pattern. And so, the weaver finds her thread, and the chronicle truly begins. Alara's story does not end in that dusty, golden-lit gallery, it finds its true, authentic starting point. Her journey, from the pristine gray silence of a life that had everything but meaning, to the textured symphony of a life dedicated to honoring the small, sacred stories of others, is a powerful testament to the quietest yet most profound of miracles, the miracle of a redirected heart. It is a story that whispers a universal truth to the hollow ache so many of us feel in the relentless pursuit of a world that values achievement over authenticity, and noise over stillness. We are all, in some way, living in a gilded cage of our own making, asking the same desperate question into the silence, is this all there is? Alara's answer did not come in a thunderclap or a blinding flash of light. It came in the form of a gentle, insistent whisper, a divine course correction that could only be heard when she finally fell to her knees in surrender. Her prayer was not eloquent. It was not polished. It was the raw, unfiltered cry of a soul at the end of its own strength, an admission of utter brokenness. And it is in that precise space, the space of "I can't do this anymore," that grace so often finds its entry point. The miracle for Alara was not that God answered, but that he had been waiting all along for her to finally ask the right question. Not "what can I achieve," but "why did you make me?" He didn't give her a map with a final destination, he gave her a compass, a true north, and the courage to take the first, uncertain step into a new dawn. Her story is a beautiful reminder that our past is never wasted. The decade she spent in the corporate world, a time she saw as a hollow diversion, was, in fact, her training ground. She was spinning the very thread she would later need to weave her true life's work. Her eye for design, her understanding of narrative, her ability to see the core of a message, these were the gifts honed in the gray world of marketing that she could now consecrate to a higher purpose. She learned to tell stories to sell products, so that one day she could tell stories to save souls, including her own. It's a powerful message for all of us. The skills you are learning now, the trials you are enduring, even the jobs you may feel are draining you of life, may just be God preparing the thread for the magnificent tapestry He intends for you to create. He is the ultimate weaver, and no color, no texture, no length of yarn in our lives ever truly goes to waste in His masterful hands. Alara learned to see the world not as a marketplace of consumers, but as a sanctuary of souls, each with a story worth telling, each a testament to the resilience of faith. She became a mender, finding the divine beauty in the interruptions, the tears, and the worn places of human life, and she discovered that in mending the stories of others, her own fractured spirit was made whole. We want to extend our deepest, most heartfelt gratitude to you, our cherished audience, for walking alongside Alara on this intimate and transformative journey. Thank you for investing your time, your attention, and your heart in her story. In a world saturated with fleeting distractions, your willingness to sit in the quiet spaces with these characters, to listen to the music of Mikhail's violin and feel the texture of Lena's crimson yarn, is a gift. Stories like this one only come alive when they are received by an open and willing spirit. You are not just a passive audience, you are a vital part of this chronicle, a community of witnesses to the quiet, everyday miracles that unfold when a human heart opens itself to the possibility of divine purpose. Your presence here makes this work meaningful, and for that, we are endlessly thankful. You are the reason we continue to search for and share these chronicles of faith. This story, The Echo in the Silence, is just one of many such journeys that we are humbled and blessed to share here on our channel, Prayer Miracles. We believe that God is still speaking, still working, still weaving His beautiful patterns into the fabric of our modern world. The miracles are not always grand and earth-shattering. More often, they are as quiet as a shift in perspective, as personal as an answered prayer in a lonely apartment, and as profound as finding your life's true calling. If Alara's story resonated with the echoes in your own heart, if you too are searching for the light in the gray, or if you simply wish to be reminded of the incredible power of faith and prayer to transform a life from the inside out, then we warmly and humbly invite you to become a part of our growing community. Please, take a moment to subscribe to the Prayer Miracles channel. By subscribing, you are not just getting notifications for new videos, you are raising your hand to say, I believe in hope. I believe in purpose. I believe that even in the noise of the 21st century, the whisper of God can still be heard. Hit that notification bell as well, so you won't miss a single story of transformation, a single testament to the enduring power of a prayerful heart. Join us as we continue to chronicle the extraordinary work of God in ordinary lives. Let us fill this digital space with light, with hope, and with the undeniable evidence that miracles still happen every single day. Until our next story, may God bless you and keep you. May His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And may you have the courage to ask the big questions, the faith to listen for the quiet answers, and the eyes to see the brave, beautiful color waiting to be woven into your own magnificent pattern. Thank you for being here.